You're looking at the man you called a squatter, but the land beneath your feet belongs to my family, and the law is about to prove it. I still remember the exact sound that morning. The low rumble of a sheriff's cruiser rolling down my gravel driveway. The crunch of tires over the same stones my grandfather placed there almost a century ago. The smell of fresh-cut pine from the old trees lining the property. And standing beside my rusted iron gate was Victoria Caldwell, the president of Silver Oak Estates, holding a stack of papers like she had already won. She didn't look nervous. She looked certain. That was the part one will never forget. Victoria had the kind of confidence that comes from believing rules only apply to other people. She adjusted the papers in her hand, looked straight at me, and said, "Mr. Whitmore, you've been occupying community property without authorization. You're officially being removed as a squatter." A squatter. That word hit differently coming from someone standing on land my family had owned for 100 years. My boots were planted on the same ground where my father taught me how to repair fence posts. The same field where my grandfather spent his mornings drinking coffee before sunrise. The same place where generations of Whitmores had built a life long before Silver Oak Estates existed. But Victoria wasn't interested in history. She was interested in control. Behind her sat a brand new subdivision with identical homes, perfect lawns, and expensive stone entrances. She called it progress. I called it forgetting whose land they built their dreams on. The sheriff stepped out of his vehicle, holding a folder and wearing the calm expression of someone who had handled plenty of neighborhood disputes. Victoria immediately walked toward him. "Sheriff Mercer, thank goodness you're here. This man refuses to leave." She said it loudly enough for the neighbors gathering near the road to hear. She wanted an audience. She wanted everyone to believe I was the problem. I watched quietly as Sheriff Daniel Mercer opened the folder she handed him. He looked at the documents. Then he looked at me. Then he looked back at the papers. For a moment, nobody said anything. The wind moved through the trees behind me, carrying the familiar sound of branches rubbing together. Victoria smiled, waiting for the moment she thought would finally prove her right. But then Sheriff Mercer lowered the folder and his entire expression changed. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said slowly, "before we continue, I need to ask you one question." Her smile faded slightly. "What question?" The sheriff looked at me and nodded respectfully. "Judge Whitmore, would you like to explain what happened here?" The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. Victoria's confidence disappeared for the first time that morning. She had spent months calling me a problem. She had spent weeks telling people I had no right to be there. But what she didn't know was that I wasn't just the owner of this land. I was someone who understood every word written on those papers she was holding. My name is Nathaniel Whitmore, and this is the story of how an HOA tried to take my family's century-old property, only to discover they had challenged the one person who knew exactly how to make the law work. 90 years before Silver Oak Estates put up its first polished entrance sign, my family was already waking up with the sunrise on that land. The first thing I remember about the property was not the house. It was the sound, the quiet rhythm of morning, the creaking of the old wooden barn doors, the soft whistle of wind moving through the tall grass behind the pasture, the distant hum of my father's old tractor starting before most people in town had even poured their first cup of coffee. That land was never just a piece of property to me. It was a timeline of my family's life. My great-grandfather, Samuel Whitmore, purchased those 120 acres in 1924 with money he saved working long days at a local mill. He did not buy it because it was valuable. Back then, nobody imagined this quiet stretch of countryside would become surrounded by expensive neighborhoods and perfect rows of houses. He bought it because it was home. The original deed stayed in a small wooden box inside our family office. The box itself was nothing special. The corners were worn smooth from decades of hands opening it, reading it, and protecting what was inside. But every time I touched that old wood, I remembered what my father used to say. Land is not valuable because of what you can sell it for. It is valuable because of what you leave behind. My father spent his entire life maintaining that property. He repaired fences, planted trees, and marked every boundary carefully. He taught me how to measure twice before making a decision. He taught me that patience was not weakness. It was discipline. Those lessons followed me into my legal career. Before people knew me as a judge, I was simply Nate Whitmore, a man who grew up fixing fence posts and carrying tools across open fields. The courtroom came later. The responsibility came later. But the principles were always the same. Listen carefully. Look at the evidence. Let the truth speak. That was exactly why Victoria Caldwell underestimated me. She looked at my old farmhouse, my work boots, and my weathered fence lines and saw someone who belonged to the past. She never bothered to understand that the past was exactly what protected me. When Silver Oak Estates first started developing near my property, I welcomed the neighbors. I had no problem with progress. New families deserved a place to live. Children deserved safe streets. Communities needed to grow. But Victoria saw something different when she looked at my land. She did not see history. She saw an obstacle. I still remember the first time she walked onto my property. The smell of her expensive perfume mixed strangely with the scent of fresh soil after a morning rain. She looked across the fields, not like someone admiring the view, but like someone already imagining what she could replace. This area has potential, she told me. I asked what she meant. She smiled and said, sometimes old properties need to make room for the future. At the time, I thought it was just a comment. I was wrong. That sentence was the beginning of everything. Victoria did not want to become my neighbor. She wanted to become the person who decided whether I was allowed to stay. And the biggest mistake she made was believing that because I stayed quiet, I was unaware of what she was building against me. The first time Victoria Caldwell showed the neighborhood what she was really capable of, she did it with a smile. That was the part that bothered me most. Anger is easy to recognize. A smile hiding a plan is much harder. I remember standing on my front porch early one Monday morning, holding a cup of coffee while the mist lifted from the fields behind my house. The smell of damp earth mixed with the cedar from the old barn. It should have been a peaceful morning. Instead, I watched a white luxury SUV roll slowly up my gravel driveway. Victoria stepped out wearing a perfectly pressed blazer, carrying a leather folder under her arm. She looked around my property like she was inspecting something she already owned. Nathaniel, she called out, we need to discuss your compliance issues. I almost laughed at the phrase. Compliance issues. That was how Victoria spoke when she wanted ordinary people to feel like they were already wrong. She never said, I have concerns. She said things like violations, enforcement, and community standards. Words designed to sound official even when they were built on nothing. I walked toward the fence line and asked what she meant. She opened the folder and handed me several pages. The papers listed complaints from the HOA board. My barn was described as outdated. My fence was called inconsistent with neighborhood appearance. My property sign, the one my grandfather carved by hand decades ago, was labeled an unauthorized structure. I looked at the pages carefully. Every complaint was written in professional language. Every sentence sounded serious. But behind the polished words was the same message. They wanted my land to stop looking like it belonged to my family. Victoria, I said, this property existed long before Silver Oak Estates. She smiled. That may be true, but things change. Neighborhoods evolve. I looked past her toward the rows of identical homes beyond the trees. Perfect lawns. Matching mailboxes. The same stone decorations in every yard. Everything designed to look valuable. Everything designed to look the same. Progress is not the same as replacing people, I told her. Her expression changed for only a second. It was small, but I noticed it. Victoria did not like being challenged. She had built her reputation around making people uncomfortable enough to stop asking questions. Over the next few weeks, her pressure increased. Letters arrived in my mailbox. Notices appeared on my door. Each one carried a different complaint. The old wooden fence needed approval. The barn required review. The driveway needed adjustment. The list kept growing. It felt like someone was slowly covering my family history with paperwork. But I did something Victoria did not expect. I stayed calm. I photographed every notice. I saved every email. I copied every document. Years in the courtroom taught me something important. The loudest person in the room is not always the person with the strongest case. Evidence does not care about confidence. It does not care about expensive clothes or important titles. It simply waits. Victoria believed she was pushing an old landowner into surrendering. She believed I was too attached to the past to understand the future. What she did not realize was that I had spent my entire life studying the difference between authority and arrogance. And soon, she was going to learn that those two things were never the same. The first sign that Victoria Caldwell was changing tactics came in the form of a document that looked official enough to scare almost anyone. It arrived on a cold Thursday morning, tucked neatly inside my mailbox between a utility bill and a letter from my bank. The paper felt heavier than it should have. Maybe that was because I knew exactly what it represented. Another attempt to make me believe my own land did not belong to me. I stood beside the mailbox post my father built by hand, listening to the quiet hum of the wind moving across the fields. The smell of dry grass and old wood filled the air. For a moment, I could almost hear my grandfather walking across the property like he did every morning. Then I opened the envelope. Inside was a formal notice from Silver Oak Estates. It claimed my property violated community ownership standards. Community ownership standards. I read that sentence 3 times because I could hardly believe someone had written it. My family had owned that land since 1924. Silver Oak Estates had existed for only a few years. Yet Victoria had found a way to make a few pieces of paper sound more powerful than a century of history. The notice demanded that I attend a hearing with the HOA board. It listed concerns about my barn, my fence, and the appearance of my property. But buried near the bottom was the real issue. They questioned whether I had legal authority to remain on the land at all. That was the moment I understood Victoria's strategy. She was not trying to convince me to make small changes. She was trying to create a record, a paper trail that would make her story look real. I had seen the same tactic many times inside a courtroom. A person repeats a claim often enough, surrounds it with documents, and hopes nobody takes the time to look deeper. But facts do not disappear just because someone prints them on official-looking paper. The HOA meeting took place the following week inside their community clubhouse. I walked through the doors and immediately noticed the difference between my world and theirs. The room smelled like fresh coffee and polished furniture. The walls displayed photographs of the neighborhood's newest developments. Everything looked carefully arranged. Victoria sat at the front table with several board members beside her. She had prepared for this moment. "Mr. Whitmore," she began, "the board has been patient, but your refusal to cooperate has created ongoing issues." I looked around the room. Several neighbors avoided eye contact. They were not angry. They were uncertain. They had heard one version of the story for months. Victoria continued explaining that my property was outdated, inconsistent, and harmful to the community image. She spoke smoothly, confidently, almost like she was presenting a closing argument. But she made one mistake. She underestimated the importance of every word she used. I took notes. I saved every statement. I recorded every detail. When the meeting ended, Victoria approached me with a small smile. "Nathaniel, I think you need to accept that times have changed." I looked at the papers in my hand and then back at her. "Times change," I said, "but ownership does not disappear because someone wants it to." She walked away believing she had gained control. What she did not know was that every document she created was becoming part of the evidence that would eventually reveal the truth. The morning after the HOA hearing, I woke up before sunrise. The house was quiet except for the soft ticking of the old wall clock in my kitchen. I poured a cup of coffee and walked outside with the folder Victoria had given me sitting on the table behind me. The air smelled like damp soil and cedar wood. The same smell I remembered from childhood mornings when my father and I walked the property line together. But that morning felt different. Something had changed. Victoria believed she had moved the fight into her territory. She thought paperwork, meetings, and official language would make her untouchable. What she did not understand was that paperwork was exactly where the truth lived. I spent the next several days doing what I had always done in my legal career. I collected facts. I did not make accusations. I did not make threats. I simply followed the trail. I started with the oldest documents in my family archive. The original deed, the property surveys, the county records. Every page told the same story. My family owned the land. The boundaries were clear. The history was documented. Then I started looking into Silver Oak Estates. That was when I noticed something unusual. The HOA documents Victoria presented at the meeting referenced a revised property map. A map that showed parts of my land differently than the official county records. At first, I thought it was a simple mistake. People make mistakes. Numbers get entered incorrectly. Maps get updated. But then I found the dates. The changes happened shortly after Victoria became HOA president. That was not a random error. That was a pattern. I sat at my desk late into the evening, surrounded by copies of documents and handwritten notes. The only sound in the room was the turning of paper and the rain tapping against the window. I remembered something my father always told me. The truth does not need to hurry. It just needs to arrive. So I kept looking. The more I examined the records, the more questions appeared. Why were certain documents missing from the HOA archive? Why did the board rely on a private survey instead of the county records? Why did every conversation about my property seem to lead back to Victoria? A few days later, I received another letter. This one was different. It was not just a notice. It was a formal demand claiming that I was occupying land that belonged to the community. They used the word unauthorized. They used the word trespass. They wanted neighbors to see me as someone who did not belong. I read the letter carefully and placed it beside the others. Every accusation, every claim, every carefully chosen phrase. Victoria was building a story, but she was also creating a record, and records could be examined. Records could be challenged. Records could reveal what someone wanted hidden. I looked out the window toward the old fields where my grandfather once planted trees with his own hands. For generations, my family protected that land without needing attention or recognition. We simply respected what it represented. Victoria thought she was removing an obstacle. She thought I was just an old landowner refusing to accept change. She had no idea that every move she made was bringing me closer to the one thing she feared most. The complete truth. The day I found the missing piece of the puzzle, I was sitting alone at my kitchen table with the same wooden box my grandfather had kept for decades. The room was quiet except for the sound of rain tapping against the windows and the low hum of the old refrigerator in the corner. Inside that box were generations of documents, memories, and proof that my family had protected this land long before anyone had heard the name Silver Oak Estates. I spread the papers across the table and compared them one by one with the documents Victoria Caldwell had presented. The more I looked, the clearer the pattern became. She was not just making claims. She was building a version of history that did not match reality. But there was one detail she never noticed. She did not understand who I was before I became the man standing on that property line. Years earlier, I had spent my career inside courtrooms. I had listened to thousands of arguments, reviewed endless documents, and watched people try to win with confidence instead of facts. The lesson was always the same. The truth usually hides in the details everyone else ignores. I had chosen not to reveal my position because I wanted to see how far Victoria would go without knowing. I wanted the evidence to speak first. The next morning, I returned to the county records office. The smell of old paper and dust filled the building as I walked through the archive room. A clerk helped me locate the original property records connected to my family's land. There it was. The official survey from decades ago. The legal boundaries. The signatures. The history. Everything Victoria claimed was impossible was sitting quietly in a government file, waiting for someone to look. Then I found something else. A copy of the revised map Silver Oak Estates had been using. At first glance, it looked professional. But after years of reading legal documents, I noticed something most people would miss. The approval process was incomplete. Certain signatures were missing. The recorded information did not match the county records. Someone had tried to make a private document look like an official one. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the pages in front of me. Victoria had spent months trying to convince everyone that I was the problem. She wanted the neighborhood to see an old family property as an inconvenience. But she had made one mistake. She underestimated the value of patience. When I returned home that evening, the sun was setting behind the fields. The golden light stretched across the grass, touching the old fence posts my father installed when I was a child. I stood there for a long moment and thought about everything that had happened. The notices, the meetings, the accusations. None of it was random anymore. Victoria was not fighting against a piece of land. She was fighting against a documented history she could not rewrite. A few days later, another letter arrived from Silver Oak Estates. This time, Victoria was taking the next step. She claimed the matter required official enforcement. She wanted authorities involved. She believed that once the sheriff arrived, I would finally be forced to accept defeat. I placed the letter beside the others and smiled quietly. She still believed she was dealing with someone who could be pushed aside. She still believed the person standing in her way was just a stubborn homeowner. She had no idea that the next person who arrived at my property would recognize exactly who I was before I said a single word. The morning Sheriff Daniel Mercer arrived at my property, Victoria Caldwell looked happier than I had ever seen her. She stood near the entrance of my driveway with a folder pressed against her chest, wearing the same confident expression she had carried through every HOA meeting. The sky was gray, and a cool breeze moved across the fields. I could smell the rain coming, and the old cedar fence beside me carried the familiar scent of wet wood. For a moment, everything felt strangely quiet. Then the sheriff's vehicle stopped near the gate. Victoria immediately stepped forward. "Sheriff Mercer, thank you for coming. This has gone on long enough." She spoke as if the conclusion had already been decided. She handed him the documents she had prepared and began explaining her version of events. She told him I had refused to cooperate. She told him I was occupying property that belonged to the community. She told him the HOA had been patient. What she did not tell him was that every statement was supported by documents that did not match the official records. I stood beside the old iron gate and watched Sheriff Mercer review the paperwork. He did not rush. He did not react. He simply read. That was something I respected about him. He understood that facts deserved attention before opinions. Victoria, however, seemed uncomfortable with the silence. "Sheriff, the situation is very clear," she said. "We just need him to understand that the property rules apply to everyone." Sheriff Mercer continued reading. Then he looked up at me. His expression changed slightly. Not confusion. Recognition. "Nathaniel Whitmore?" he asked. I nodded. For a second, Victoria looked relieved. She probably thought he was finally identifying the person she wanted removed. Then Sheriff Mercer lowered the papers. "Judge Whitmore, I did not realize this was your property." The air changed instantly. Victoria stopped moving. The confidence she had carried all morning disappeared. "Judge," she repeated. Her voice was quieter this time. Sheriff Mercer looked at her. "Yes, Judge Nathaniel Whitmore." I could almost feel the questions forming in her mind. The person she had spent months describing as stubborn, outdated, and difficult was not someone who ignored the law. I had spent decades understanding it. Victoria looked back at the documents in her hand. The same documents she had used to intimidate neighbors. The same documents she believed made her untouchable. Suddenly, they looked much smaller. "Why did you not tell anyone?" she asked. I looked across the fields toward the old barn. The answer was simple. Because I wanted to know if the facts would matter before my position did. Sheriff Mercer opened the folder containing the county records I had provided. He compared them with the HOA documents Victoria submitted. The differences were impossible to ignore. The property boundaries did not match. The approval records were incomplete. The claims about ownership had no legal foundation. Victoria had built her entire argument on assumptions and paperwork that could not survive examination. For months, she believed my silence meant weakness. She believed I was waiting for someone else to fight my battle. But I was never waiting. I was documenting. I was observing. I was letting every decision she made become part of the truth. Sheriff Mercer closed the folder and handed the documents back. "Mrs. Caldwell, I think we need to have a different conversation about these records." For the first time since this began, Victoria did not have an answer ready. And that was when I knew everything had changed. She came expecting to remove a man from his own land. Instead, she had introduced the evidence that would finally reveal what she had been trying to hide. The days following Sheriff Mercer's visit were quieter than I expected. After months of letters, meetings, and accusations, the sudden silence felt almost strange. Every morning, I walked the same gravel path along the edge of my property. The same path my grandfather walked nearly a century earlier. The same path Victoria Caldwell wanted people to believe I had no right to use. The smell of fresh rain stayed in the air, mixing with the scent of old timber from the barn. But something had changed. The pressure was gone. Not because the problem disappeared, but because the truth had finally entered the room. Sheriff Mercer's review of the documents opened a door Victoria could no longer close. The county began examining the records connected to Silver Oak Estates. Officials requested copies of the HOA files, property maps, meeting notes, and approval documents. For the first time, the paperwork Victoria used as a weapon was being examined by people who knew how to read every detail. And details were where her story started falling apart. The private property map she relied on did not match the official county survey. Several records referenced during HOA meetings were missing important approval information. The timeline raised questions that Victoria could not explain with confidence. I watched from a distance as the same process she had used against me started working against her. Not because anyone wanted revenge, because the facts finally had a chance to speak. A week later, I attended another HOA meeting. This time, the atmosphere was completely different. The room that once felt like a place where Victoria controlled every conversation felt smaller. Neighbors who had stayed quiet for months began asking questions. Some admitted they had received similar notices about their own properties. Others said they had always wondered why certain decisions seemed to benefit only a few people. Victoria sat at the front table, but the confidence was gone. The polished presentation was replaced with short answers and careful pauses. She no longer spoke like someone delivering a final decision. She spoke like someone trying to explain one. When it was my turn to speak, I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I simply placed the documents on the table. The original deed, the county survey, the records showing my family's ownership history. Then I explained something I had learned after years in courtrooms. Laws are not powerful because people fear them. Laws are powerful because they protect the truth when someone tries to ignore it. The room stayed quiet. I looked at the faces around me and saw something I had not seen before. Not fear. Understanding. People were beginning to realize this was never just about my land. It was about what happens when someone believes a position gives them unlimited control. After the meeting, Sheriff Mercer walked outside with me. The evening sun was setting over the fields, casting long shadows across the grass. He looked toward the old barn and smiled. "Your family took good care of this place," he said. I nodded. That was always the goal. Victoria had spent months trying to prove I did not belong. But the evidence showed something she never expected. I was not standing on borrowed ground. I was standing on a legacy that had been documented, protected, and passed down for generations. And now, the people who questioned that legacy had to answer for why they tried to erase it. The final meeting of Silver Oak Estates was held on a bright Tuesday morning, almost 3 months after Victoria Caldwell first stood at my gate and claimed I had no right to remain on my own property. The difference between that day and this one was impossible to miss. Before, Victoria walked into every room like she owned the outcome. Now, she entered carrying a folder filled with explanations instead of decisions. The clubhouse smelled like fresh coffee and polished wood, but the atmosphere was completely different. The confidence that once filled the room had been replaced by careful silence. The HOA board review confirmed what the records had shown all along. My family's property boundaries were legitimate. The century-old deed was valid. The private documents used by Victoria and the board did not have the authority they claimed. The attempt to redefine my land had not been a misunderstanding. It had been a failure to respect the facts. Victoria eventually stepped down from her position as HOA President after the board members voted to restructure their process. The same position she once used to make people feel powerless was now being rebuilt around transparency and accountability. I never celebrated her downfall. That was never what this was about. The purpose was never to embarrass someone. It was to protect what was rightfully ours and make sure the same thing did not happen to someone else. A few weeks later, I walked through my property early in the morning. The sun was just beginning to rise over the fields, painting the grass with a golden glow. The old fence posts stood exactly where they had for decades. The barn doors still carried the marks of years of repairs. The air smelled like pine, fresh soil, and the quiet beginning of another day. I stopped near the same gate where everything started. I remembered Victoria standing there with her papers, believing she had already won. I remembered the neighbors watching, unsure of what to believe. And I remembered Sheriff Mercer looking at the documents and understanding the truth before anyone else said a word. That moment taught me something important. Power is not always found in the person speaking the loudest. Sometimes it belongs to the person who is willing to wait, gather the facts, and let the truth arrive on its own schedule. My family never protected this land because it made us powerful. We protected it because it carried our memories. Every tree, every fence post, every corner of that property represented someone who came before me and someone who would come after. Victoria thought she was fighting against an old piece of land. She never understood she was challenging a story that had been written for 100 years. Today, Silver Oak Estates continues to grow. New families move in. Children ride bikes along the streets. The neighborhood has become something different from what it was before. But one thing remains unchanged. The Whitmore property still stands. The same fields, the same barn, the same ground where my family built a life. And every morning when I open that old wooden gate, I remember the lesson I learned from the entire experience. Justice does not need to shout. It does not need to demand attention. It simply needs patience, evidence, and the courage to stand where the truth belongs. What would you protect more, your family land or your family legacy?